Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
President Trump says there will be very severe consequences if Iran restarts its nuclear program. It follows his decision yesterday to withdraw from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. The move has left other countries, including Britain, who've signed up to it, trying to salvage what they can of the agreement. The Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, told MPs that Britain had no intention of walking away from the deal. The nuclear agreement was signed 3 years ago between Iran and 6 other countries, including America, the UK and Russia. Iran agreed to limit its nuclear activities and allow in international inspectors in return for the lifting of economic sanctions. Our diplomatic correspondent James Landale reports.
In Iran, there's a ritual way of denouncing the United States, and today they took it to the floor of their parliament, burning the US flag and shouting death to America. The country's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, denounced President Trump's decision to abandon the deal that Iran struck to curb its nuclear program in return for lifted sanctions. But he warned that Iran would leave the deal too, unless European countries guaranteed their trade.
If you can get a guarantee that we can put confidence in, then you can continue. If you don't succeed in obtaining a definitive guarantee, and I really doubt that you can, at that moment, we cannot continue like this.
For he knows that many in Iran believe the nuclear deal never provided the economic benefits they were promised. And on the streets of Tehran, people were worried about what the crisis would mean for them.
The first feeling I got was that I should not stay here anymore. Even when we didn't have sanctions, our economy was terrible, and with this decision, I don't know what will happen.
We are living in hope, and I hope our leaders will take decisions to limit the damage to our country.
I remind the House that the JCPOA is an international agreement.
In the Commons, the Foreign Secretary tried to reassure the Iranian people, echoing France, Germany, Russia and China, in promising to stand by the deal.
Britain has no intention of walking away. Instead, we will cooperate with the other parties to ensure that while Iran continues to restrict its nuclear program, then its people will benefit from sanctions relief in accordance with the central bargain of the deal.
Today, the UN watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Agency, confirmed that Iran's nuclear facilities were complying with the terms of the deal. But European leaders believe Iran must do more to restrict its behavior in the Middle East, and the US must explain how.
We know that this deal is only finding solutions for a limited space of time. That's why we have to talk with Iran about what happens after that. How can we make sure that there is just a civil and no military nuclear program?
For this deal to survive, Britain and its allies are going to have to persuade European businesses to keep trading with Iran despite the risks. They're going to have to persuade Iran that that trade is valuable. It means jobs and investment. And they're going to have to persuade the US not to enforce those sanctions too harshly. Well, none of that is going to be easy. But that won't stop supporters of the deal from trying. Today, the Russian president used Moscow's victory parade to lobby the Israeli Prime Minister. President Macron of France spoke to his Iranian counterpart, and there'll be more discussions in London in coming days. The EU wants to exempt its firms from US sanctions, but few expect President Trump to bend, because he believes the financial freedom of the nuclear deal allowed Iran to fund its hostile behaviour in Syria and Yemen. He told his cabinet Iran will have to negotiate or something will happen.
I would advise Iran not to start their nuclear program. I would advise them very strongly. If they do, there will be very severe consequence.
This may not be the first time the US has been denounced on the streets of Iran, but it's rare that the echoes have been heard in the capitals of Europe. James Landale, BBC News.
Our North America correspondent Nick Brandt is at the White House. And as we just heard there, President Trump saying that Iran will negotiate or something would happen. Not clear what he means, though.
Yeah, these were off-the-cuff, impromptu remarks. I can't offer any clarity what he meant by that. Frankly, I'm not sure if he could either. Ordinarily, when US presidents talk about very severe consequences, they're raising the spectre of military action, but there's no indication that is in the offing. This was Donald Trump being Donald Trump, and he believes that unconventional approach to diplomacy is working. That press spray reminded me of his fire and fury comments that were directed towards North Korea. And he thinks they work there, and it looks, Sophie, like he's playing the same kind of playbook now with Iran.
Meanwhile, North Korea and 3 American prisoners have just been released. A goodwill gesture, says the president.
Yeah, and there has been a mood of celebration here at the White House this morning. They haven't been overly concerned about the European reaction to the Iran deal. They haven't been fretting about the global response. They have been celebrating the news of the release of these detainees. Donald Trump will meet them at 2 o'clock in the morning when they touch down in Washington. It's the kind of made-for-TV moment that appeals to the reality TV side of his personality. And Donald Trump was also asked whether he deserved the Nobel Peace Prize this morning. He said everybody was saying that, but he also added the prize he is looking for is victory for the world.
Nick Bryant in Washington. Thank you.
After a day of condemnation over his decision to pull America out of the Iran nuclear deal, President Trump was not backing down today. He warned of dire consequences if Iran kick-started its nuclear program. His decision last night prompted angry scenes in the Iranian parliament as the American flag was burned. World leaders have spent the day scrabbling to salvage what they can from the agreement. Here, Boris Johnson insisted the UK would not walk away from the deal. Our correspondent Dan Rivers has the latest.
In Iran's parliament, this was the response to President Trump's announcement. The symbolism was clear, if a little awkward. Hardliners have been vindicated. Trust in America vaporized. Even moderates here are left wondering if the nuclear deal can stand without the United States. And the rhetoric is being dialed up as tensions rise. In front of crowds chanting death to America, the country's supreme leader rebuked President Trump with a string of personal insults. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei said President Trump will die and his body will turn into food for worms, accusing him of telling at least 10 lies during the announcement to break the nuclear deal. This evening, President Trump gave this stark warning to Iran.
I would advise Iran not to start their nuclear program. I would advise them very strongly. If they do, there will be very severe consequence.
At Westminster, Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson underlined Britain's commitment to the agreement, even though that now puts the UK at odds with its oldest ally.
Britain has no intention of walking away. Instead, we will cooperate with the other parties.
President Trump's decision to sign off on abandoning the Iran deal is also accompanied by a threat to impose secondary sanctions on any firm that trades with Iran. That could impact several European companies. Plane makers Airbus and Boeing had signed deals worth $39 billion to sell aircraft to Iran. The French oil company Total also had a $5 billion deal to develop the country's gas field, while the car manufacturers Renault and Peugeot Citroën had both negotiated deals to build and sell cars there. But of more immediate concern is the sudden rise in tensions in the Middle East. Suddenly, the world's most volatile region appears even more unstable. Dan Rivers, ITV News.
Let's go straight away now to our Washington correspondent, Robert Moore. Now, Robert, condemnation, as we've seen from Iran, and a commitment from European countries to press ahead with the deal. But is any of this going to matter to President Trump?
I think the only lesson you can draw from this is that the president's instincts are now entirely driving the decision-making process. I've never seen so much European pressure on an administration that was coordinated over the last couple of weeks. We've had President Macron here, Chancellor Merkel, Boris Johnson. They all pleaded, they all begged, they cajoled. They were comprehensively ignored. And now, as Dan was saying, European companies that do business with Iran are facing the prospect of secondary sanctions. Given the power of the US banking system, many of those companies are going to have to almost certainly abandon those deals with Iran. But it is much more than just about Iran. For example, on Monday, the US embassy in Jerusalem opens. In the eyes of European governments, that's another example of a needless provocation.
And the president himself seems to be more preoccupied with North Korea than Iran at the moment, doesn't he?
That's certainly the case. I mean, in the last few hours, the president has said that within the next 72 hours, we are going to know the site and the date of the meeting of the summit with Kim Jong-un. Mike Pompeo, the US Secretary of State, is in Pyongyang at the moment. He is bringing back with him, they're currently in the air, 3 American citizens. They are Korean Americans. They will be flying back, arriving back here in Washington early tomorrow morning. Understanding the visual imagery behind that, you can guess who might be on the tarmac to receive them. President Trump himself.
Indeed. Robert Moore in Washington. Thank you.
President Trump has warned Iran against resuming its nuclear weapons program following his decision to pull the US out of the Iran nuclear deal. He spoke of very severe consequences if they do. The world, at the same time, has been reacting to the US move, Russia saying it was deeply disappointed. China has expressed regret. Iran's supreme leader addressed the US president directly, telling him he had made a mistake. The UK said today it has no intention of walking away from the deal. Britain, Germany, France and Iran will meet next Monday. Our Washington correspondent, Kylie Morris, has this.
As Iran's supreme leader had said, if they tear it up, we will set it on fire. And so they did. A group of hardline MPs at the opening session of the Iranian parliament, inside the modernist building, returning to a traditional setting. Death to America, they shouted, as they set the text of the nuclear deal alight.
Mr. Speaker.
There was a less inflammatory mood in the Commons, instead a sense of polite disappointment and regret.
The government regrets the decision of the US administration to withdraw from the deal and to reimpose American sanctions on Iran. We did our utmost to prevent this outcome. From the moment that President Trump's administration took office, we made the case for keeping the JCPOA at every level. For as long as Iran abides by the agreement, and the IAEA has publicly reported its compliance, Iran's compliance, 9 times so far, then Britain will remain a party to the JCPOA.
That's not what President Trump has in mind. This is a move aimed at strong-arming Europe into a more confrontational stance toward Iran, and he's willing to risk a transatlantic rift to achieve that. But for now, Europe is sticking together.
Denn gestern hat der amerikanische Präsident ja entschieden.
Yesterday, America's president decided he would withdraw, but France, the United Kingdom and Germany have all decided we will remain committed to the agreement.
Not only that, but the EU says it will challenge through the World Trade Organization any secondary sanctions that punish European companies like French car manufacturers Citroën and Peugeot for doing business in Iran.
It makes the United States the world's economic police, and that's not an acceptable situation.
Not acceptable, but it is what it is, according to US Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, who says the sanctions are coming and America's allies need to get out of the way.
These are very, very tough sanctions. So although we have a wind-down period and we are being careful with the transition, I would also say there are primary sanctions and secondary sanctions. And these will go after the entire U.S. dollar financial system here and globally. So our objective is to make sure that we cut off the money to Iran, and these are very powerful tools that we will enforce.
Washington has signaled it will punish anyone, friend or foe, for doing business with Iran, even as Europe, Russia and China signal they're staying in the deal America walked away from, as long as Iran keeps to its side of the bargain. The deal prohibits Iran from possessing uranium with a high enough concentration of the key isotope to make a nuclear bomb, and limits the amount of enriched uranium to 97% less than before. It also prevents them from operating the only plutonium reactor in the country, which could also be used to fuel a nuclear weapon. Thus far, Iran has fully complied. Uranium enrichment requires centrifuges. Before the deal, Iran had 20,000. The agreement allows for just over 5,000. To date, Iran has fully complied. The deal also demands full and unrestricted access for inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency to all its nuclear facilities. By that measure too, so far, Iran has fully complied. Iran's President Hassan Rouhani is trying to preserve the deal, sending his foreign ministers to negotiate with the remaining signatories, but warning his nation could restart enriching uranium within weeks.
What are you going to do if Iran starts up their nuclear program again?
Iran will find out. They're going to find out. I don't think they should do that. I would advise Iran not to start their nuclear program. I would advise them very strongly. If they do, there will be very severe consequence. Okay?
In Tehran, they're burning pictures of the deal breaker in chief, urged on by their supreme leader, who told them in a televised address, this man Trump will die, his body will turn into ashes and food for worms and ants, but the Islamic Republic will continue to stand. On the streets, in a new twist, protesters hold posters with a quote written alongside the British, German and French flags saying, "I don't trust these three countries either." Also at those protests, I should mention, there was criticism of the moderate Rouhani government for the fact that it signed the deal in the first place. Hardliners are, of course, making the absolute most of this, delighting in the US breaking its commitment on a deal many of them never supported. I should say also we're learning more about the rollout of these new US sanctions, particularly those secondary sanctions, which are putting a lot of European companies in a very hard place, basically forcing them to choose, according to those advising them, between doing business in the US and in Iran. Now, some companies, we're told, are choosing to wait and see whether in the 6 months before the most cataclysmic sanctions come into effect, negotiations could bring some other outcome.
Well, now, Kylie, at the same time, on a completely different subject, but perhaps related, the president is boasting of a diplomatic coup.
Yes, John, this is Secretary of State Mike Pompeo returning from North Korea with 3 American citizens who'd been detained for periods between 1 and 2 years, facing charges like spying. So yes, this is a coup. It's also a quick change of subject, which means perhaps less oxygen for critics of what the president just did on the Iran deal. Although his supporters would say, look, this is just evidence that the Trump approach to negotiation might just pave the way for a better deal in North Korea and Iran. Let's hope for everyone's sake they're right.
Kylie Morris in Washington. Now, one of the major players in the long road to bring about the Iran nuclear deal, and who was credited with having a decisive role in the negotiations with Iran, was Baroness Catherine Ashton. She now joins us from South London. Baroness Ashton, you worked on this deal for 4 very long years. How difficult was it?
It was very difficult, John. I began my work in the days of the Ahmadinejad presidency. And we spent 2 years working with his team before President Rouhani came in, and we saw a distinct change of atmosphere. You will recall how clear it was that there was a possibility that they would be interested in doing a real agreement, which is, of course, what we negotiated.
But the really interesting thing is you weren't just the chair, you actually negotiated direct. At one point, I believe the Iranian Foreign Minister, Mr. Zarif, wouldn't negotiate with anybody else. Everybody else left the room and you negotiated.
I did some of the negotiations, but I wouldn't want to take away from the 6 nations who were represented through all of those years, both at ministerial level and at political director level, who did a fantastic job. It is an agreement that belongs to the Security Council, which was the body that gave me the mandate to do the negotiations. And it does belong to the 6 countries who, year after year, worked tirelessly to try and get an agreement.
Well, how do you feel now that it's been scrapped? And indeed, does the president actually have the power just to scrap it if it does reside in the Security Council?
Well, President Trump has decided that America will not continue with the agreement, and so he has the presidential power not to move forward with it, of course. For the other countries, we've heard in the last 24 hours their commitment to continue with the agreement. And as you were describing, there are meetings that are being set up now to discuss how to take that forward. So my ambition would be that this agreement could continue, and we could continue to see this great diplomatic effort bear fruit, because after all, the International Atomic Energy Authority, charged by everyone with the job of independently verifying that Iran was complying with the agreement, have said they were.
You're a human being. You must feel pretty strongly about this tonight.
Well, I feel strongly about it in a couple of different ways. One is, it was 4 years of my life. I spent a huge amount of time working on this agreement. I felt it was really important, not just for its own sake, but also to show that diplomacy could work and to show that we could do tough diplomacy and come to some serious conclusions. But I also feel that it's important, in having brought together different nations who frankly don't traditionally work together. We don't do many things where we work with Russia and China so comprehensively as we did with the US and with the European nations, and to do so in an effort that was in a way worldwide to try and solve a problem. And it feels to me like we need more diplomacy, not less.
Well, talking of that, the President of the United States is crowing about his hardball diplomacy in North Korea, freeing 3 Americans and possibly leading ultimately to something there. Could hardball diplomacy work with Iran?
Well, the challenge is really that some of the arguments used against this agreement have been about other issues where there are genuine and real concerns about what Iran is doing, especially in the region. I have talked many times with colleagues in the Gulf states and of course in Israel who've got real concerns and worries. The difficulty I have is understanding why you would stop working with a deal that is working and not focus on those other issues, but rather return to an agreement and try and do something different. I just don't understand that, rather than actually focusing and concentrating on those issues.
Baroness Ashton, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, one country celebrating the demise of the Iran deal is Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu thanked President Trump for his courageous leadership and his commitment to ensure that Iran never gets nuclear weapons. One key factor for Israel's rejection of the Iran nuclear deal is what Jerusalem sees as the storms gathering on the country's borders, all whipped up by Tehran. To the north lies Lebanon, a country increasingly influenced by the Shiite militia group Hezbollah, which is armed and funded directly by Iran and designated a terrorist organization by the US. To the east lie the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights, which border Syria, where senior Iranian commanders and militia backed and funded by Iran, including Hezbollah, have fought to take back vast swathes of territory alongside President Assad's troops. Overall, Israel has become increasingly concerned about what they see as the Iranian-dominated Shia crescent, which runs from Beirut through Baghdad and onto its primary sponsor, Tehran. Well, our international editor, Lindsay Hilson, joins me now from Jerusalem. So, Lindsay, are the Israelis pretty happy about what President Trump has done?
Well, certainly the supporters of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, whose vision of how this works, I think, is laid out in that map. His whole political life, he has said that the main enemy of the Jewish state is not the Palestinians, it's not the Arabs, it's the Iranians. And if this Iran nuclear deal was thrashed out, negotiated in Europe, as we've just heard from Baroness Ashton, it was unmade here in Jerusalem. You cannot exaggerate what huge influence Prime Minister Netanyahu had on President Trump to make the decision that he did. Now, last night, what the Israelis did was they said, look, get to the bomb shelters up on the border with Syria, there in the Golan Heights, because Iranian forces are closer to the Israeli border than they have ever been, because they have bases over there in Syria. And Israel has attacked those bases, and they fear that Iran will attack back. Well, maybe that was just propaganda, but certainly it doesn't make this place or the region feel particularly stable, thanks to the withdrawal of the accord.
Indeed. Well, President Netanyahu has been in Moscow today talking to President Putin, but they'd appear to be on opposing sides on this one, wouldn't they?
Yeah, it's a strange relationship. I guess you could call them frenemies, because Netanyahu was there thanking Putin on the anniversary of World War II, because, of course, the Russians, the Soviet Union, were on the side of Jews against the Nazis. But now President Putin is backing up President Assad and Iran in Syria. So that shows how complex the region is. I remember in Vienna, John Kerry, who was the lead person on this deal, he said, I fought in Vietnam, and when I came back, I said that from now on I want to pursue diplomacy, because I've seen what war has done. Neither Donald Trump nor Benjamin Netanyahu have fought in a war. The danger is that war may be what happens now. Some people here are very worried about that.
Lindsay, thank you very much. Well, I'm joined now from Washington, D.C. by Chris Wilson, a Conservative pollster and strategist who was the Director of Research and Analytics for Senator Ted Cruz's presidential campaign. Mr. Wilson, would you say that the world is a safer or more dangerous place after the scrapping of this deal?
Well, I think it's too early to say what 24 hours will have brought, but I think the world is a more dangerous place due to the deal initially. And I can tell you, as your last guest was from Israel, I actually stood on the border of Lebanon with a brigadier general from the Israeli Armed Forces who pointed out to me where the missiles were, the 150,000 missiles that are pointed into Israel that were funded by the $100 billion that this deal released.
But
and so there's nothing about that made me feel safe.
Nevertheless, the agreement curbed Iran's nuclear activities, as verified countless times by the atomic authorities. And now Iran says that it could restart uranium enrichment within weeks, and that potentially could trigger a nuclear arms race, further destabilizing an already unstable region.
Well, I would suggest that up before this deal, the United States was doing a good job controlling what was the development of the arms race. And let's be clear, this deal would have allowed them to fully acquire nuclear weapons by 2031 regardless. By 2020, they would have been able to acquire, the ban on imports and exports of missiles would have stopped. By 2023, the ban on ballistic missiles and nuclear-grade centrifuges would have gone away. So it's not as if this was a long-term solution anyway. And that's why you saw Israel and so many here in the U.S. who said this was not a good deal from a standpoint of being able to stop the development of nuclear weapons. And frankly, all it was a band-aid that enriched the Iranians and therefore enriched Hezbollah. And frankly, it was something that wasn't supported by a majority of the American people.
You talk about no long-term agreement, but I mean, there's certainly no long-term agreement now. There's no plan B. Donald Trump promises a plan B, but there's no sign of that. He promised a plan B over the Paris climate deal, for example.
He has, you're right, Kathy. And I think the difference between this administration and maybe past administrations is North Korea illustrated today, as we saw the release of 3 hostages, is we may not know everything that's going on. I think the typical approach to political diplomacy has been maybe a bit misplaced, has been to float trial balloons and see what the American people or the public or the international community may be supportive of. And that's certainly not Donald Trump's approach. I think more of it is done behind closed doors. And it's, again, if North Korea is any example of what's going to develop with the future of this deal, I think it's probably the right approach, and maybe it is the world today requires that type of approach.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned North Korea, because what kind of message does it send to Kim Jong-un that a deal can be done and then reneged on, which is what's happened with Iran?
Well, you know, we have constitutional requirements here in how treaties are supposed to be executed. And let's be clear that Barack Obama did not follow those requirements. This deal should have gone to the House, should have gone to the Senate for ratification, and that didn't happen. In fact, a majority of the House and Senate actually voted against this deal. So I think what it does say to a leader of a foreign country is we have a constitution for a purpose, and the way in which treaties and agreements with foreign countries are executed should follow that constitution. And if it doesn't happen, if it doesn't go before the Senate and is ratified, then it's probably only worth about the paper it's written on. And that was really the argument against Obama, even for those who were supportive of this deal. Many in the Democratic Party denounced it because he did not follow constitutional protocol in terms of the way that it was executed. And I think that's something that any of us on the right or the left, for this agreement or against this agreement, but that are American citizens and support the Constitution, should hope for in future international agreements.
Well, American citizens stand to lose out, don't they, economically? When you look at Boeing, for example, signed a deal to supply planes to the Iranian airlines. That deal now in jeopardy, therefore tens of thousands of American jobs in jeopardy.
Well, it's, you know, the whole focus of how this may impact jobs, I think, again, becomes unclear. Let's face it, the American economy, whether you like Trump or dislike Trump, you support him or disagree or oppose him, you cannot argue with the success right now of the economy and low unemployment. So I do think it probably gives the president a little more negotiating power whenever we might have been concerned about a situation like that, say whenever unemployment was high or the jobs were low, that, well, what does this mean for the American worker? But at this point, when you look at the feelings, and as you mentioned in the introduction, I'm a pollster, you look at the concerns of the American people, the economy, because it is going so well right now, has started to dip down, and security has risen up to the top, particularly with many Republican voters right now, which is really the president's base.
Chris Wilson, I'm really sorry to interrupt
and I think that's what
you.
he's addressing.
We've completely run out of time, but thank you very much.
Earlier, Lindsay Hilsum said from Jerusalem that Donald Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had not fought in wars. That is true of President Trump, but not of Prime Minister Netanyahu, who fought in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. We're sorry about that mistake. He was in Moscow today with Russian President Putin, who has expressed concern over President Trump's move. Victory Day in Moscow, and Russia had its full military might on display. Soldiers and advanced military weaponry paraded through Red Square, marking the anniversary of the defeat of Nazi Germany. One day after President Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, Russian President Vladimir Putin highlighted the need to learn the lessons of history.
All the countries, all the people in the world must realize that the world is very fragile, and its stability is strengthened by our common intention to listen, trust and respect each other.
In contrast to Trump's announcement yesterday, Putin firmly asserted that their door was open to dialogue.
Russia is open for dialogue on all the questions of ensuring global security, ready for constructive equal partnership for the sake of agreement, calmness and progress on the planet.
Putin is said to be deeply concerned at the US move to pull out of the deal. In contrast, the guest of honor at today's events, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, is a strong proponent of the move.
It's hard to believe, but just 73 years after the Holocaust, there is a country in the Middle East which is openly calling for the destruction of the State of Israel.
Well, earlier I spoke to Michael McFaul, who under President Obama served as US ambassador to Russia and author of From Cold War to Hot Peace. I began by asking him what he made of President Trump's move.
I think it's a tragic mistake. I do not understand it. I honestly don't understand the logic of President Trump when he explained it, how this makes the United States of America better off, more secure. I hope he has a plan B. I fear he doesn't. And I think this leads to more complicated relationship with Iran on the first instance, but also complicating instances and complicating our relationship with our allies. I hope it doesn't go on, but and to do even more damaging things, but I don't think it was a good day for America.
And what is the dynamic with the Russians? Because you have Putin actually expressing deep disappointment. I mean, where do you see that headed?
Well, formally and publicly, of course, President Putin is going to say he's disappointed that we pulled out. I think more quietly, they like this. They like being on the side of the international community. After all, Vladimir Putin has been isolated a lot, especially after he annexed territory, Crimea in Ukraine, and then went into eastern Ukraine. That's when he was isolated from everybody else. This event puts him in good standing with the international community and isolating the United States of America.
And clearly it tips over into the Middle East, and there Putin can strut about as some kind of a peacemaker.
That's exactly right. He looks like he's the deal maker. He's the one that has relationships with everybody, with Iran, with Mr. Assad in Syria. Prime Minister Netanyahu is in Moscow today at the May 9th celebrations. So he looks like he is very involved diplomatically, and we look like we're the ones that are pulling out.
What if Trump's diplomacy actually works? I mean, let's look at North Korea. He's got 3 Americans out, it seems. We haven't seen them yet, but we think they're out. He is apparently sort of kicking both sides into coming up with an agreement. And it's all been hardball. Maybe that is the nature of modern diplomacy.
Maybe. And most certainly coercive diplomacy has worked in the past. And if President Trump succeeds in getting a deal that leads to actual denuclearization in North Korea, I will be the first one to write a letter nominating him for the Nobel Peace Prize. And so we need to wait and see. And I'm thrilled that those 3 Americans got out of North Korea. That's a concrete action, a concrete outcome that we should give him credit for. But I'm skeptical. I still don't see the pathway forward. And I'm especially skeptical because if we just pulled out of the deal with Iran, I think that makes it harder now for us to pivot and say, well, we're going to try to do a similar kind of deal with North Korea. But my eyes are wide open, and if he succeeds, I will applaud him.
Ambassador McFall, thank you very much indeed for talking with us.
They've been burning the US flag in the Iranian parliament. President Trump has made threatening noises about what might happen if Iran resumes its nuclear program. It seems like this is an almighty struggle between Iran and the US. It is that, of course, but there's another way of looking at it. This is the first time Europe and President Trump have set themselves up for a showdown. Trump wants an end to the deal, but does America have the power now over banks and trade to drag the Europeans out of the deal too? Or do the Europeans now have the clout to resist American sanctions and keep the deal intact and keep European companies in business in Iran? Well, Gabriel Gatehouse has been looking at how this clash of strategies could play out.
When Donald Trump announced his intention to pull the United States out of the Paris climate deal last year, the rest of the world said, well, that's a shame, but we're going to carry on anyway. The deal still stands. On Iran, Britain and others are trying a similar tactic.
Britain has no intention of walking away. Instead, we will cooperate with the other parties to ensure that while Iran continues to restrict its nuclear program, then its people will benefit from sanctions relief in accordance with the central bargain of the deal.
But how realistic is that? The US now says it'll reimpose sanctions as well as penalise companies around the world that do business with Tehran.
The business community will weigh their options and weigh their risks, and they'll see that the US market is much larger than the Iranian market and with much less risk, and the choice will be rather obvious. No publicly traded company can choose Iran over the United States. It would be a disastrous decision.
So we can expect international companies to withdraw their business in certain sectors, including oil. The sanctions will likely force countries to reduce their purchase of Iranian oil, hurting the economy further. So what might Tehran's response be? Well, so far the Iranian president has said that the deal remains in place if the goals of the deal remain in place, i.e. that Iran continues to get economic benefit. But it's not likely that the European nations will be able to do much to mitigate the effects of sanctions on Iran. In the Iranian parliament today, hardline MPs burnt a copy of the nuclear agreement. The hands of those who'd like to restart Iran's nuclear program have been strengthened. So what are their options? They could resume uranium enrichment or production of centrifuges. They could limit access for international inspectors. If it looks like Iran is moving back towards a place where it could produce a nuclear weapon, even the European nations and Russia and China will find it hard to stay on board.
Europe has to keep the door open because they are currently the only bridge between Washington and Tehran. Europe and Iran will be playing for time. Time hoping that President Trump might not be re-elected in 2 years.
Meanwhile, Britain finds itself in an unusual position, siding with the European Union, which it's busy leaving, against its staunchest ally and partner in special relationships.
As long as Donald Trump remains president, we must get used to a world without American leadership. A world where efforts to secure peace and progress on the greatest challenges facing the planet must be made, not just without American cooperation, but often in the face of this administration's active opposition.
If this is a test of Europe's clout, then it is in the field of business rather than diplomacy that it'll find itself most challenged. But what if the United States isn't stepping back from global leadership? What if, fresh from playing hardball with North Korea, Trump thinks he might get a better deal by putting the squeeze on Iran?
I think we're seeing a different type of US leadership. It's not multilateral, it's very direct, it's very selfish, if you will. This is about America first. And this is a president that is all about making sure he keeps his campaign promises and demonstrates to the American people that he can be accountable.
Could nevertheless be effective.
Anything can happen.
This is a massive gamble. Best case scenario, a stronger Iran deal is built out of the ruins of the old one. Worst case scenario, Iran starts building the bomb and it's war.
Gabriel Gatehouse there. Interestingly, Europe has in the past clashed with the US on Cuban sanctions. And for example, 11 years ago, an Austrian bank was being taken over by an American company. The Austrian bank dropped some Cuban clients. The bank said its new owner couldn't allow it to keep Cubans as customers. The Austrian government threatened to fine the bank for breaking an EU regulation not to respect US sanctions that it deemed extraterritorial. Well, in that case, the US actually gave a license to the American buyer to keep the Cuban clients, so no Austrian fine was needed. Well, I'm joined now by Bill Burns, former Deputy Secretary of State under President Obama, a key architect of the Iran deal, who went for quiet talks with Iran before the negotiations became public. And very good evening to you, and thanks so much for joining us. The great dilemma for Europe, Ambassador Burns, is do you yield to Trump when you so profoundly disagree with what he's doing, or do you try and keep the deal alive and potentially threaten, you know, an argument with the US about being a sanctions buster for an American policy to keep sanctions up?
Well, I think the risk is obviously that, you know, this could be the biggest rift in relations within the transatlantic alliance since, you know, 2003 and the war in Iraq 15 years ago. I have no doubt but that our European allies, who played such a crucial role in producing the comprehensive nuclear agreement with Iran, will do everything they can to try to persuade the Iranian government to continue to live up to its obligations under the agreement. And our European allies have also gone a long ways toward addressing legitimate concerns that we share about Iranian behavior beyond the nuclear agreement across the Middle East. But I think the dilemma is going to come when the Trump administration follows through in its determination to apply secondary sanctions to discourage European businesses from operating in Iran, trading and investing, which will then produce an atrophy of the kind of economic benefits that the Iranian government looks for as part of the Iranian nuclear agreement. And in that kind of circumstance, I think it becomes very, very difficult to sustain the agreement. So while I admire the effort that our European allies are obviously continuing to make, I think it's going to be very, very hard to hold the agreement together in the face of that kind of economic pressure from the US.
If Airbus wants to sell planes to the Iranians and Airbus is told you'll be sanctioned by the United States if you do, effectively Europe just has to give in and yield to what President Trump wants.
Well, it's a pretty stark choice. Or European governments, you know, engage in what in effect would be a kind of trade war with the US, in which they're only losers, I think. So I don't doubt that the determination of our European allies to try to preserve the agreement, but I think it's going to be very hard.
So basically, you're very pessimistic that the Europeans can hold the agreement together, and thus pessimistic for it carrying on.
Yeah, I'm afraid, I don't mean this as a sort of American-centric view of this, but I think the American role was essential in helping to produce this agreement. And I think, you know, as we pull out of the agreement, it's going to be very difficult to hold it together. And I think that's deeply foolish.
How does that make you feel personally? I know you invested a lot of your diplomatic career to making this thing come alive, this agreement, and watching it, you know, die in 24 hours from your country's president. What does that make you feel as a career diplomat?
Well, it's personally very disappointing, as it is for the dozens and dozens of other people from a lot of other countries who worked very hard to help produce this agreement. But, you know, much more important than that personal disappointment is the broader disappointment in a situation where here, for once, hard-nosed diplomacy produced an outcome, preventing Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, produced a coalition of countries that worked very hard together to achieve that. And at a moment when diplomacy ought to matter more than ever on the international landscape, we're rapidly eroding it. And the United States, I'm afraid, is hemorrhaging trust right now. After pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, and now the Iran nuclear agreement, we're squandering what ought to be one of the biggest assets of the United States, our alliances, our ability to mobilize coalitions of countries, what sets us apart from lonelier powers like Russia and China. And as I said, I'm afraid we're rapidly squandering that advantage.
I think we should point out that a lot on the Trump side would say actually it's working, the Trump style. Today, 3 American prisoners in Korea released. They say that, you know, the tough talk, the slightly bombastic style that we're all getting used to seems to deliver results. I don't know whether do you put credence in that?
Well, I mean, it's certainly a very welcome step that the Trump administration has produced the return of 3 Americans, you know, unfairly detained in North Korea. That's a welcome step. I hope very much that the president's upcoming summit meeting with Kim Jong-un is also a success, although I think there's a pretty wide gap in what the two sides define as denuclearization right now. But I think that exercise in diplomacy is important. But what we're seeing on the Iranian nuclear agreement is not just, you know, bombast or rhetoric. It's the physical act of withdrawing from the agreement, which I think is unfortunately going to produce a fatal blow to what was a real diplomatic achievement, which we share with our European allies.
Ambassador Burns, thanks very much for talking to us tonight. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Now, word from Tehran. Joining me from that city is Syed Mohammad Mirandi, a professor in North American Studies at the University of Tehran. I think there's an appalling delay on the line. Professor Mirandi, can I ask you, can Iran stay in a deal with 5 nations rather than 6? And we've just heard that probably the Europeans are not going to be able to maintain all the trade they would like with Iran.
Well, it's possible, but I think it's highly unlikely. As your previous guest pointed out, Iran would be demanding solid commitments by the European Union that they will resist any attempts by the Americans to intimidate European business people and European businesses, banks and other financial institutions, insurance companies, oil companies, and so on. From what we see so far, the Europeans seem very weak. When we saw the French president go to the United States, Iranians felt that despite his pleading and his appeasement, Trump humiliated him. The dandruff incident, for example, or when the German chancellor went to the United States, she too came back empty-handed. So when Iranians see that, they feel that the Europeans are not in a very strong position and that they are not of great consequence.
Well, that's important what you've just said. Let me ask you to focus on inside Iran, because obviously there are different coalitions inside Iran trying to jostle for position. Who does this strengthen inside Iran? Does it strengthen the hardliners, the conservative hardliners, or the more liberal side?
Well, that's difficult to say. Obviously, it doesn't help President Rouhani, but I don't think it really hurts him all that much either. I think all the different sides have won something here. The conservatives or the principalists or the hardliners or whatever they call them in the West, they feel vindicated because they said from the beginning that the United States is dishonest and that we can't trust them and they will not abide by their commitments. And the United States really hasn't abided by its commitments even from day one. Under Obama, they passed laws that violated Articles 26 to 29, and behind the scenes, the U.S. government put pressure on banks and insurance companies not to do business with Iran, and again, that was a violation. Under Trump, it got worse. So they felt vindicated. On the other hand, those who were in support of dialogue and the negotiations, they felt that, well, we gave it a chance. We showed the international community that the United States wasn't being honest and that we were the side that fulfilled our side of the bargain. And I also think what Pompeo just recently said, a few weeks ago, he went, when he was still the head of the CIA, he went to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he admitted there that even before the nuclear deal, the Iranians weren't pursuing a nuclear weapon. And he said this basically to tell the people in Congress, don't worry, if we pull out, Iran's not going to seek a nuclear weapon.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, Professor Morandi, with such a big delay on the line, but I just have to put a question to you. The Americans don't trust Iran, and it's not just Donald Trump, it's a lot of Americans don't trust Iran. And they're right not to. I mean, you've never admitted the nuclear program. You stand there in your parliament burning the flag saying death to America, and you are operating throughout the region. And I just wonder whether Iran somehow is just complicit in the bad image it has in the United States.
I disagree. What I was trying to say was that Pompeo basically admitted that before the nuclear deal, Iran was not pursuing a nuclear weapon. On the other hand, you have to look at the history. Iran, our national government in 1953 was overthrown. The U.S. supported the brutal Shah, the secret police. They supported Saddam Hussein, gave him chemical weapons to use extensively. So did the Europeans. I personally survived 2 chemical attacks, including sarin and mustard gas. Hundreds of thousands of Iranians died in the war that the West supported. They imposed enormous sanctions, and Iran always abided by international law with regards to its nuclear program. We can go into a separate discussion on that.
We're out of time. Thank you so very much. Thanks for joining us. I'm sorry about the delay on the line.
And we're going to kick off talking a little bit about Donald Trump. 2 different stories now that we've got, big stories. Front page on The Time picks up on the news that Donald Trump announced last night that he was pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal. Today has seen European countries trying to make sure that the deal can be held together without the US part of it.
No, because we've got to remember this was a 6-nation deal with Britain, France, Germany, Russia and China, as well as the US. He's unilaterally pulled out. It's clearly a deal breaker, not a deal maker, whatever. That book was ghosted for him all those years ago. But now the European Union and Britain, France, Germany are quite rightly saying you might impose economic sanctions, impose them on American companies. Don't begin imposing them on other companies. Otherwise, it could be if British, French, German companies doing business with Iran, if they try and do business in the States, then he begins to block them. He's got to be fought back. I mean, the bloke is, he's a bull in a china shop, and he's a complete idiot on this because that deal was successfully working in stopping Iran developing nuclear weapons. They denied they had a program before, but we know they had. They got rid of most of the enriched uranium. They put concrete in the plutonium reactor. It was successful, and yet under prompting from Saudi Arabia and Israel, he's gone and put his foot in it big time.
Well, look, I'm not here to defend Donald Trump, and nor will I. But I will say this: there is no doubt that that Iran had been heavily fortifying its military capability in Syria. A lot of those missiles are aimed at Israel, and that's not just propaganda by Israel. That's confirmed. Iran was not reining itself back in. It was spreading more and more misery and mischief and discontent in the Middle East. And of course Trump's view is that by relaxing the sanctions, it was giving them more money to fund military action, to help fund the civil war in Syria on behalf of Bashar al-Assad, who was the West particularly like, although of course if the West had taken him out, he could easily have been replaced by IS. However, where we are with the actual deal, I mean, it's not clear, is it yet? I think there's a 90-day cooling off period, isn't there? In which time Britain may be able to, maybe the President of the United States persuades Iran to go back to the negotiating table and to come up with a new deal. That's the plan.
Well, and he might say, look at what happened with North Korea.
Yeah.
I threatened them with sanctions. I threatened them with bellicose talk, and I've now got Kim Jong-un to the table. Could that work here?
Right. It was economic sanctions that really worked in North Korea rather than military threats.
Well, that's what he's doing here.
What you're doing here, in the end, the world is a less safe place. You complain about Iran being in Syria. I wish every country was out of Syria, including including the UK and the US, were militarily involved. Well, and I wish Israel would stop bombing in Syria too. Can it work? I don't think it will. Look, there's a painstaking agreement here which is stopping Iran getting a nuclear weapon. There's only one country in the Middle East with nuclear weapons at the moment, that's Israel. You don't want more to get them. I quite like everybody, including Britain, to scale back and go non-nuclear and get rid of nuclear weapons everywhere. He's now created a situation, if Iran goes for its nuclear program again, you're going to end up going to war, or they will get nuclear weapons. Now, before, they were not going to get nuclear weapons. Now they might.
There's another thing here too. President Macron of France invested an awful lot in this new relationship with the President of the United States. So he had the President to dinner on the top floor of the Eiffel Tower, all very nice. He was the first European to have an official state visit to Washington, and he talked a lot about the Paris Accord and the Iran deal, and the President has humiliated Macron, frankly. Wow. Mrs. Merkel went out there too. She got nowhere. Boris Johnson did the same. At least the Prime Minister didn't get sucked into it. He is going to do his own thing. He's doing his own foreign policy. And you have to remember, Kevin, in his manifesto for the presidency of the United States, he said he was going to do this.
He didn't say he was going to. He said he was going to dismantle it.
He said it was a bad deal.
Stronger. But of course, he is America first. But I fear for your Brexit trade deal now. When he does this.
Let's move on, because there's so much else to talk about as well. The other development today is on the front page of the Eye, and this is the fact that three detainees are being released from North Korea.
Well, they're flying back with the new Secretary of State, and this is good news. These are three, their dads, their husbands, sons, all that, so that's great news. And Kim Jong-un has been in China again, meeting the Chinese president, and he's talking about denuclearizing, demilitarizing the peninsula. So, and Trump has said a date has been set, a venue has been set for the historic meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un. Look, Kevin will never have a positive word ever to say about Trump. I don't like Donald Trump, but on this, he seems to be making great strides forward. Clinton never got to meet the North Korean leader. This is Trump really taking a bull by the horns.
It's great the three are released, unquestionably. I think there's now been 10 released in 5 years, 10 Americans who've been held in North Korea. Of course, Trump will pretend these are the first ever to be released in the history of the world, in the greatest diplomatic coup ever for an American president.
Well, he's only been president 18 months.
What is he saying, though, to Kim Jong-un when America does a deal with Iran and then pulls out of it? You gonna now say to Kim Jong-un, pull out.
He'll say
stop doing your weapons.
Well, he'll say it wasn't his deal.
The bloke is so mercurial, unpredictable, deranged.
He'll say, I've been consistent about this to North Korea. The Iran deal was useless and it was a bad deal, and I don't want anything part of it.
But then Kim Jong-un might say, what about future presidents? They may pull out of any deal I strike with you.
And if I get rid of my nuclear weapons, then you can attack me.
Yeah, but he's a president on a roll here, and the fact he's got Kim Jong-un to see him face to face, well, that's huge. Who'd have thought that? More than Mr. Obama did, and Mr. Obama got the flipping Nobel Peace Prize after 9 months for doing nothing.
Look, I'm a disarmer. I think we've got to put greater effort into getting countries to have fewer arms, certainly nuclear weapons, not weapons of mass destruction. If Saddam Hussein in Iran had nukes, would he have been attacked? No. If Gaddafi had kept on with his programme and had weapons of mass destruction of some sort, would he have been attacked? Probably no. So I'm afraid you do a deal with Iran, then you pull out of it. Kim Jong-un's going to think, hang on, and that's right. Well, what are you going to do in the future? If I give up my nuclear weapons, not that I actually believe he ever will.
But it's the sanctions. His country has been crippled by these sanctions imposed by China and the United States.
It's economic sanctions.
And they're economic sanctions, and they've crippled him, and I think he can't go on much longer. The way it is.
Well, it's fascinating to see how it'll go. I think we're going to find out in a few days when that meeting is going to take place. So,
where is it going to be as well?
Indeed.
They've clearly not told Trump, otherwise he would have tweeted it, probably with an error. But,
we'll wait and see for
Maybe it's at Mar-a-Lago, whatever they call that
his
place.
golf resort. That would be funny.
On the 18th green.
It would be funny.
On the 18th green.
Not for all the people in prison camps in North Korea, but it would be funny just to see.